Case 1. Meaonia Michelle Allen. July 1993. Choctaw County. It was a summer morning in rural Choctaw County when a horrifying discovery was made, a discovery that would remain unsolved for decades. A newborn baby boy, deceased, found in circumstances that pointed to foul play. But in 1993, forensic technology had its limits. The child had no name, no identity, and seemingly no mother who would claim him. Investigators worked the case hard in those early days, interviewing potential witnesses, canvassing the area, searching for anyone who might have recently given birth. But the leads dried up. The case went cold. For 27 years, that baby boy remained nameless. Investigators never forgot him, but with limited evidence and no viable suspects, the case file gathered dust in storage. The child was buried, mourned by strangers who would never know his story. Then, in the late 2010s, something changed. DNA technology had advanced by leaps and bounds. Genetic genealogy, the same technology that would eventually catch the Golden State Killer, had opened new doors for cold case investigators. Detectives in Choctaw County decided to take another look at the Baby John Doe case from 1993. They submitted DNA evidence to forensic laboratories that specialized in genetic genealogy. The process was painstaking. Researchers built family trees, tracking down distant relatives, eliminating suspects, and slowly closing in on the truth. Month after month, the circle grew smaller. Finally, in 2020, they had their answer. The mother of the deceased infant was identified as Meaonia Michelle Allen, who had been living in the area at the time of the baby's death. When confronted with the evidence, Allen could no longer hide from what she had done 27 years earlier. The details that emerged painted a tragic picture. Allen, young and apparently in crisis at the time, had concealed her pregnancy from everyone around her. When she gave birth alone, instead of seeking help or finding a safe place for the child, she made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She killed her newborn son and disposed of his body, then went on living as though nothing had happened. For nearly 3 decades, Allen carried this secret. She went about her life while a tiny victim lay in an unmarked grave, unknown and unnamed. The advancement of science finally gave that child justice. Allen was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case drew national attention, not only for the horrific nature of the crime, but also for the incredible detective work that solved it. It served as a reminder that time and technology could finally bring accountability, even when decades had passed. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence along with circumstantial evidence, placing Allen at the scene. The defense had little to work with. The science was irrefutable. Allen eventually accepted responsibility for her actions, though the damage had been done long ago. The community of Choctaw County, which had wondered about the identity of the baby for so long, finally had answers. But those answers brought no comfort. Only the sobering reality that a mother had killed her own child and hidden that crime for most of her adult life. This case reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied. Technology continues to evolve, and cold cases that once seemed impossible to solve are being cracked open. If you have information about any unsolved case, no matter how old, please come forward. You never know what piece of evidence might be the key. If this case moved you, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button. Cold Case Hour depends on viewers like you to keep bringing these important stories to light. Case 2. Raye Dawn Smith. October 2007. Lincoln County. The small town of Meeker, Oklahoma, seemed like an unlikely setting for one of the state's most notorious child abuse cases. With a population barely over 1,000 people, Meeker was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where kids played in quiet streets and families attended church on Sundays. But behind the door of one home, a little girl named Kelsey Smith Briggs was suffering in ways that would eventually shock the entire state. Kelsey was just 2 years old, with blonde hair and bright eyes that should have been filled with wonder and joy. Instead, she became the victim of systematic abuse that would ultimately cost her life. And at the center of this tragedy was her mother, Raye Dawn Smith, who failed in the most fundamental duty any parent has, to protect their child. The warning signs had been there for months. Kelsey had been hospitalized multiple times for suspicious injuries. She had suffered a broken leg at 18 months old, an injury that medical professionals questioned. The Oklahoma Department of Human Services had been involved with the family. There were investigations, reports, concerns raised by doctors and relatives who could see something was terribly wrong. But Kelsey remained in her mother's care, and the abuse continued. Raye Dawn Smith was in a relationship with Michael Porter, a man who would later be convicted of Kelsey's murder. But Smith's role was not passive. Prosecutors would later argue that she enabled the abuse, that she knew what was happening to her daughter and did nothing to stop it. Worse, she actively participated in the mistreatment and concealed the extent of Kelsey's injuries from authorities. In October of 2007, Kelsey was once again injured. This time, the damage was catastrophic. The little girl suffered severe internal injuries that would prove fatal. Instead of immediately seeking medical help, precious time was wasted. When Kelsey finally arrived at the hospital, it was too late. On October 11, 2007, Kelsey Smith Briggs died from her injuries. She was just 2 years old. The autopsy revealed a horrifying catalog of trauma. Kelsey had been beaten repeatedly. She had old injuries alongside new ones. The medical examiner's report painted a picture of a child who had endured tremendous suffering in her short life. The community of Meeker was devastated. How had this happened? How had a 2-year-old girl been failed so completely by the very system designed to protect her? The outrage was immediate and widespread. Michael Porter was charged with and ultimately convicted of first-degree murder in Kelsey's death. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But the focus also turned sharply to Raye Dawn Smith. What was her responsibility in all of this? Prosecutors charged Smith with enabling child abuse, a lesser charge than murder, but one that acknowledged her critical role in Kelsey's death. The argument was straightforward. Smith knew the abuse was occurring. She had the power to stop it or remove Kelsey from danger, and she chose not to act. Her inaction enabled Porter to continue hurting Kelsey until the final, fatal assault. The trial was emotional and highly publicized. Kelsey's father, who had been fighting for custody of his daughter, testified about the uphill battle he faced trying to protect her. Medical professionals described the pattern of injuries they had documented. DHS workers were questioned about what they knew and when they knew it. In the end, Raye Dawn Smith was convicted of enabling child abuse. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The sentence sparked debate. Some thought it too lenient given that a child had died, while others felt it appropriately reflected her role versus Porter's more direct culpability. Kelsey's case led to significant changes in Oklahoma's child welfare system. Her death became a rallying cry for reform, for better training of caseworkers, for more aggressive intervention when abuse is suspected. The legislature passed Kelsey's Law, which strengthened penalties for those who enable child abuse and improved how the state handles custody cases involving abuse allegations. But no law could bring Kelsey back. No reform could undo the suffering she endured or restore the life she should have had. Her story remains one of the most heartbreaking failures of the child protection system in Oklahoma history. Raye Dawn Smith's name will forever be associated with her daughter's death. She had choices at every turn: to protect Kelsey, to leave Porter, to tell the truth to authorities. And at every turn, she chose wrong. The consequences of those choices cost an innocent child her life. This case is a stark reminder that abuse often happens with the knowledge or complicity of multiple adults. It's not enough to simply not be the one inflicting harm. There is a moral and legal duty to protect children from harm, especially for parents. Raye Dawn Smith failed that duty in the most devastating way possible. If you know a child who is being abused or neglected, please speak up. Call your local child protective services or law enforcement. You could save a life. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video, share it to spread awareness, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more in-depth coverage of cases that matter. Case 3. Amy Leann Hall. September 2019. Okmulgee County. The early morning hours of September 3, 2019, should have been peaceful in the small community outside Okmulgee. Families slept soundly, children dreamed innocent dreams, and the night was quiet. But inside one home, a horror was unfolding that would devastate a family and stun everyone who heard about it. Amy Leann Hall was a mother of 4 children, ranging in age from young childhood to early adolescence. To neighbors and acquaintances, the family seemed relatively normal. There were no obvious red flags, no indications that tragedy was imminent. But behind closed doors, Amy Hall was descending into a darkness that would culminate in unspeakable violence. On that September night, Hall's children went to bed as usual. They had no reason to fear their mother, no warning of what was about to happen. As they slept, vulnerable and trusting, Amy Hall made a decision that would shatter lives forever. She retrieved a gun and went to the bedrooms where her children slept. In an act of cold, calculated violence, she shot 2 of her sleeping children, killing them as they lay defenseless in their beds. A third child was also shot and wounded but survived the attack. The surviving children would be traumatized in ways that could never fully heal. The details of that night are almost impossible to comprehend. How does a mother look at her sleeping children, children she carried, birthed, and raised, and pull a trigger? What internal darkness could lead someone to commit such an act? Law enforcement was called to the scene in the early morning hours. What they found was a scene of carnage. 2 children dead, another wounded, and a mother who had just committed double murder. Officers secured the scene, tended to the surviving children, and took Amy Hall into custody. The investigation that followed sought to understand why this had happened. Had there been a mental health crisis? Was there a history of violence or instability? Friends and family were interviewed, backgrounds checked, and possible motives explored. What emerged was a complex picture, but ultimately no explanation could justify or make sense of what Hall had done. Some reports suggested she may have been experiencing psychological issues, but the deliberate nature of the killings, shooting sleeping children, suggested a level of intent that went beyond an impulsive act during a mental health episode. Hall was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and additional charges related to the assault on the child who survived. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The crime had occurred in her home, with her gun, and there was no question about who had pulled the trigger. The community of Okmulgee was rocked by the tragedy. Vigils were held for the children who died. Support poured in for the surviving children, who had lost siblings and now had to process the unimaginable fact that their mother had killed them. Schools, churches, and community organizations rallied to provide resources and comfort. The legal proceedings moved forward. Hall's defense attorneys had an almost impossible task. There was no disputing what happened, only the question of her mental state and culpability. The prosecution sought to hold her fully accountable for the premeditated murder of 2 innocent children. In cases like this, the question often arises, why didn't someone see this coming? In truth, many acts of family violence occur without clear warning signs visible to outsiders. Hall apparently concealed whatever internal crisis she was experiencing until it exploded into lethal violence. The trial process was painful for everyone involved. The surviving children had to cope with their physical and emotional wounds while the criminal justice system processed their mother's case. Extended family members struggled with grief, anger, and confusion. Amy Leann Hall was ultimately convicted of the murders. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but nothing could restore what had been lost. 2 children were gone forever, and the surviving children would carry the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. Hall received a life sentence, ensuring she would never be free to harm anyone else. But her children, both those who died and those who survived, received a sentence too. The deceased were robbed of their futures, and the survivors were left with trauma that would require years of therapy and support to process. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family violence. We often think of mothers as inherently nurturing and protective, and the vast majority are. But when that bond is broken, when a mother becomes a threat rather than a protector, the results can be catastrophic. It also highlights the importance of mental health resources and intervention. While mental illness never excuses violence, especially against children, early intervention and treatment might prevent some tragedies. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of harming themselves or others, please seek help immediately. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and crisis resources are available 24 hours a day. The children who died in this case deserve to be remembered as more than just victims. They were individuals with personalities, dreams, and potential. Their lives mattered, and their deaths should never be forgotten. If this case affected you, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Cold Case Hour and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us continue covering these important stories and keeping the memory of victims alive. Case 4. Katherine Rutan. April 2011. Pottawatomie County. When a child goes missing, law enforcement and the community typically mobilize immediately. Search parties form, volunteers scour neighborhoods, and alerts go out across media platforms. The assumption is always that the child needs to be found and returned safely. But what happens when the person reporting the child missing is also the person responsible for the child's disappearance? Katherine Rutan was the mother of a young boy named Logan Tucker. In April of 2011, she reported that Logan was missing. The initial response was exactly what you would expect: concern, urgency, and a coordinated effort to locate the child. But as investigators dug deeper into Katherine's story, inconsistencies began to emerge. Rutan's account of Logan's disappearance didn't hold together under scrutiny. Her timeline had gaps. Her explanations for where she had been and what had happened to Logan kept changing. Investigators noticed that she showed odd emotional responses during questioning, sometimes too detached, other times overly dramatic in ways that felt performed rather than genuine. As the hours turned into days and Logan remained missing, the focus shifted from a simple missing child case to something far more sinister. Detectives began to suspect that Katherine Rutan knew exactly what had happened to her son because she was responsible for it. The interrogation of Rutan intensified. Investigators confronted her with the contradictions in her statements. They pressed her on specific details. They used interview techniques designed to elicit the truth from someone who was hiding something. And eventually, the facade began to crack. Katherine Rutan admitted that Logan was not simply missing. He was dead, and she was the one who had killed him. The details of how and why were horrific, but what made the case even more disturbing was what came next. Logan's body has never been recovered. Rutan claimed she had disposed of Logan's body, but refused to provide specific details about the location. This meant that Logan's family, who were already grieving the loss of a child, could not even give him a proper burial. They could not have closure. They were left with the unbearable knowledge that Logan was gone, but without the ability to lay him to rest. This aspect of the case, the missing body, added another layer of cruelty to an already unthinkable crime. It's one thing to kill a child. It's another entirely to deprive that child's loved ones of the ability to mourn properly and find some small measure of peace. Prosecutors charged Katherine Rutan with first-degree murder in Logan's death. The fact that there was no body presented challenges for the prosecution, but it was not insurmountable. Rutan's own confession, combined with other evidence, built a strong case. The trial focused heavily on Rutan's changing stories and eventual admission. The defense attempted to argue for lesser charges or to cast doubt on the confession, but the evidence of her guilt was substantial. The jury heard testimony about Logan's life, Rutan's behavior before and after his death, and the investigative work that had uncovered the truth. Throughout the proceedings, Logan's extended family members attended court, seeking whatever justice could be obtained for a child who had been so thoroughly betrayed by his own mother. Their victim impact statements described not only the loss of Logan, but also the ongoing torment of not knowing where his remains were located. Katherine Rutan was convicted of Logan's murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge acknowledged the especially heinous nature of the crime, not only the killing itself, but also the refusal to reveal where Logan's body had been placed. To this day, Logan Tucker's remains have never been found. His family has made repeated pleas for Katherine Rutan to finally tell them where he is, to allow them to bring him home and bury him properly. But Rutan has maintained her silence on this crucial detail, continuing to inflict pain on those who loved Logan. This case raises troubling questions about how someone can harm their own child, and then compound that harm by refusing to allow the family peace. It suggests a level of selfishness and cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. Even from prison, serving a life sentence, Rutan holds one final piece of power over her victim, the knowledge of where he rests. Law enforcement has conducted searches based on various tips and information over the years, but none have successfully located Logan's remains. The case remains technically open in that sense, with investigators still hoping for information that might finally bring Logan home. For anyone watching who might have information about this case or Logan's location, please contact the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office. Even the smallest detail could make a difference. This case also serves as a reminder of the importance of community vigilance. If you notice a child who suddenly disappears from your neighborhood or school, ask questions. Follow up. Don't assume that authorities have everything handled. Your attention and concern could be what saves a child or brings justice for one who has been harmed. Please take a moment to like this video if you appreciate this thorough coverage, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscription helps us continue bringing awareness to cases like Logan's that should never be forgotten. Case 5, Neha Gupta, July 2023, Oklahoma County. The medical profession carries with it a sacred trust. Doctors take an oath to do no harm, to use their knowledge and skills to heal and protect life. Parents, too, have a fundamental duty to protect their children. So when a doctor who is also a parent uses medical knowledge to harm their own child, it represents a betrayal on multiple levels. Dr. Neha Gupta was a pediatrician practicing in Oklahoma County. She had dedicated years to her education and training, learning how to care for children, diagnose illnesses, and save young lives. She was trusted by the parents who brought their sick children to her. She understood child development, medical emergencies, and the vulnerabilities of young patients. She also had a 4-year-old daughter of her own. In July of 2023, Dr. Gupta called 911 to report a tragic accident. She claimed that her 4-year-old daughter had drowned. The child was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead. Initially, the death was treated as a terrible accident, the kind of tragic drowning that occasionally occurs despite parental supervision. But investigators began to notice details that didn't quite add up. The scene didn't match what would typically be expected in an accidental drowning. Dr. Gupta's account of events had inconsistencies, and perhaps most tellingly, her behavior struck investigators as unusual for a grieving parent who had just lost a child in a sudden accident. As the investigation deepened, the evidence began to point towards something far darker than an accident. Detectives believed that Dr. Gupta had not only killed her daughter, but had staged the scene to make it appear as though the child had drowned accidentally. Her medical knowledge gave her insight into how to make a death look accidental, but that same knowledge also gave investigators clues that this was no accident. The forensic analysis of the child's body, the crime scene investigation, and the reconstruction of events led to a stunning conclusion. This pediatrician, who had sworn to protect children, had allegedly murdered her own 4-year-old daughter and attempted to cover it up. Dr. Neha Gupta was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The charges shocked the medical community and the public. How could a doctor, someone dedicated to saving children's lives, take the life of her own child? The case raised numerous questions. What was the motive? Had there been warning signs? Was there a history of mental illness or family problems? Investigators and prosecutors worked to build a case that would answer these questions and prove beyond reasonable doubt that this was murder, not accident. The medical evidence became crucial. Experts examined the autopsy findings, looking for signs that would indicate whether the death was accidental or intentional. The defense would likely argue for accidental death, while the prosecution would need to demonstrate that the evidence proved deliberate action. The community was divided in its reaction. Some found it impossible to believe that a doctor could kill her own child. Others pointed to the evidence and argued that professional credentials don't make someone incapable of terrible acts. The case became a reminder that evil can exist in unexpected places, that education and status don't prevent someone from committing horrific crimes. For the medical community, the case was particularly troubling. Pediatricians form close bonds with their young patients and families. The idea that one of their own could betray that trust in such a fundamental way was deeply disturbing. Medical boards and professional organizations would eventually have to grapple with how to respond to a member facing such serious criminal charges. The legal proceedings moved forward through the court system. Dr. Gupta entered a not guilty plea, setting the stage for a trial where prosecutors would need to prove their case and the defense would argue for her innocence or present alternative explanations for the child's death. As of the latest information available, the case was still working its way through the criminal justice system. The wheels of justice often turn slowly, particularly in complex cases involving medical evidence and expert testimony. But the authorities were committed to seeking justice for the 4-year-old victim who could not speak for herself. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about trust and betrayal. We trust doctors with our lives and the lives of our children. We assume that parents will protect their offspring. When both of those assumptions are violated simultaneously, it shakes our fundamental sense of how the world should work. It also highlights that child abuse and murder can occur in any demographic, in any profession, at any socioeconomic level. There is no profile for a child killer that excludes educated, professional parents. Vigilance and protective systems are necessary across all communities. For medical professionals watching this, the case serves as a reminder of the ethical responsibilities that come with medical knowledge. That knowledge is a tool for healing, not harm. The oath to do no harm extends most critically to the most vulnerable patients, children, and most especially to one's own children. The 4-year-old victim in this case had her whole life ahead of her. She should have been starting preschool, making friends, learning, and growing. Instead, her life was cut short allegedly by the very person who should have protected her above all others. If this case resonates with you, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts on this troubling case, and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. We're committed to covering these difficult stories with the depth and respect they deserve. Case 6. Brennan Spencer. February 2024. Tulsa County. The first few months of a baby's life are precious and fragile. Newborns require constant care and attention. They are entirely dependent on their parents for survival, unable to communicate their needs except through crying, unable to move themselves to safety, unable to protect themselves from danger. This vulnerability is why safe sleep practices have become such an important focus for pediatricians and child safety advocates. Every year, tragically, babies die from unsafe sleep situations. Sometimes these are genuine accidents, parents who didn't know the risks, who made a mistake with devastating consequences. But sometimes, an infant death that appears to be a sleep accident is something more sinister. Brennan Spencer was a young mother in Tulsa County. In February of 2024, she called 911 to report that her newborn baby was not breathing. Emergency responders rushed to the scene and attempted to revive the infant, but the child was pronounced dead. The initial investigation looked at the sleep environment where the baby had been placed, and what investigators found raised immediate red flags. The sleeping situation was profoundly unsafe, dangerous in ways that went beyond simple mistakes or lack of knowledge. The conditions were so hazardous that investigators began to question whether this was truly an accidental death or whether there was criminal negligence involved. Safe sleep guidelines are well established and widely disseminated. Pediatricians discuss them at every well baby visit. Hospitals provide education to new parents before discharge. Public health campaigns emphasize the ABCs of safe sleep, alone, on their back, in a crib. The information is readily available. But Brennan Spencer had allegedly created a sleep environment that violated every safety principle. The baby was not placed in a safe sleeping space. There were suffocation hazards present. The situation was dangerous enough that medical examiners and law enforcement concluded that the death, while perhaps not intentional murder, was the result of such extreme negligence that it rose to the level of criminality. Spencer was charged with second-degree murder in the death of her newborn. The charge reflected the belief that while she may not have set out to kill her baby, her actions were so reckless and so far outside the bounds of reasonable parenting that she was criminally responsible for the death. The case highlighted the difficult line between accident and crime when it comes to infant deaths. Not every unsafe sleep death results in criminal charges. Prosecutors and law enforcement have to evaluate whether the circumstances reflect a terrible mistake by a grieving parent or whether there was such extreme negligence that criminal charges are warranted. In Spencer's case, the authorities determined that the latter was true. The details of the unsafe sleep environment, combined with other factors in the investigation, led them to conclude that this went beyond a tragic accident. The legal proceedings that followed were emotionally charged. The defense would likely argue that Spencer was a young mother who made a terrible mistake, that she was grieving the loss of her child, and that criminal charges only compounded a family tragedy. The prosecution would argue that Spencer's actions were so egregiously negligent that they constituted criminal conduct, that the baby's death could have been prevented if basic safety measures had been followed. For the community, the case served as a stark reminder of the importance of safe sleep education. Child safety advocates used the case to reinforce messages about how to keep infants safe. Hospitals and pediatric practices reviewed their discharge protocols to ensure parents were receiving clear information about safe sleep practices. But education and awareness could not bring back Spencer's baby. The infant, who had barely begun life, was gone. The death was preventable, which made it all the more tragic. Cases like this raise difficult questions about when to criminally charge parents whose children die from neglect or unsafe conditions. There is no easy answer. Each case must be evaluated on its specific facts. But when the circumstances are egregious enough, when the neglect is severe enough, the criminal justice system has a role in holding parents accountable. Brennan Spencer's case moved through the Tulsa County court system. The outcome would determine whether she would face prison time for her role in her baby's death or whether she would receive a different consequence. Regardless of the legal outcome, she would live with the knowledge that her child died in circumstances that could have been prevented. For parents watching this, please take infant sleep safety seriously. Always place babies on their backs in a crib or bassinet with a firm mattress and no soft bedding, pillows, or toys. Keep the baby sleep area in your room, but not in your bed. These simple steps can save lives. If you are a new parent or know someone who is, share safe sleep information. Don't assume everyone knows the guidelines. A simple conversation could prevent a tragedy. And if you see an infant in an unsafe sleep situation, speak up. It might feel awkward, but it's better to risk offending someone than to stay silent and have a baby die. This case is a reminder that parenting comes with serious responsibilities. Children's lives depend on the choices their parents make. When those choices are negligent to the point of criminality, the justice system must respond. If you found this coverage informative, please like this video and leave a comment. And make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Hour with notifications turned on so you don't miss any future episodes. Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people. Case 7. Savawna Bowen. August 2023. Tulsa County. When a baby arrives at the hospital with signs of abuse, medical professionals are trained to look for patterns. A single injury might be accidental, but multiple injuries, especially injuries in different stages of healing, tell a different story. They indicate ongoing abuse, a pattern of harm that suggests the child is in serious danger. In August of 2023, a baby was brought to a Tulsa County hospital with injuries that immediately alarmed medical staff. The infant had clearly been abused. The injuries were serious and required medical intervention. Doctors and nurses documented the trauma, photographed the evidence, and reported the case to Child Protective Services and law enforcement as required by law. The baby's mother was identified as Savawna Bowen. When questioned about how the baby sustained these injuries, Bowen's explanations did not match the medical evidence. The types of injuries present were not consistent with the accidents she described. Medical professionals, who see both accidental and inflicted injuries regularly, could tell the difference. Savawna Bowen was charged with child neglect based on the evidence that she had either inflicted the injuries herself or failed to protect the baby from someone else who was abusing the child. Either way, she was criminally responsible as the child's mother. The baby was removed from Bowen's care and placed in protective custody. Medical treatment continued, and the hope was that with proper care, the infant would recover from the physical trauma. The emotional and developmental impacts of abuse at such a young age are harder to quantify, but can be profound and long-lasting. But the story didn't end with the child's removal and Bowen's charges. Tragically, the baby's injuries proved more severe than initially understood. Despite medical intervention, the infant's condition deteriorated. The trauma that had been inflicted was too much for the tiny body to overcome. The baby died from injuries sustained in the abuse. This development transformed the case from child neglect to something far more serious. Bowen now faced potential charges related not just to abuse, but to the death of her child. The investigation intensified as authorities sought to determine exactly what had happened, who was responsible, and what charges were appropriate. For the medical staff who had cared for the baby, the death was devastating. They had done everything in their power to save the child, but the abuse had been too severe. For law enforcement and child protective services, it was a painful reminder of the stakes involved in child abuse cases, that delays or mistakes could cost lives. The community of Tulsa County mourned another infant lost to abuse. Vigils were held. Child advocacy organizations renewed their calls for better resources and faster intervention in suspected abuse cases. The baby's death was preventable, which made it all the more heartbreaking. Savawna Bowen's criminal case proceeded with the added weight of the child's death. Prosecutors would need to prove not only that abuse occurred, but also that the abuse directly caused the baby's death. Medical experts would testify about the injuries, the timeline, and the causal connection between the trauma and the death. The defense would face a difficult task. The medical evidence was compelling, and the death of the child meant that this was no longer just a case about injuries, but about a life lost. Whatever Bowen's explanation for what happened, it would have to account for injuries severe enough to kill an infant. Cases involving infant victims are particularly difficult for everyone involved. The investigators who must examine terrible evidence, the prosecutors who must present it, the defense attorneys who must represent someone accused of harming a baby, and the jurors who must weigh the evidence and reach a verdict. For the jury that would eventually hear this case, the responsibility would be heavy. They would be asked to determine whether Savawna Bowen was criminally responsible for her baby's death. They would see medical evidence, hear expert testimony, and ultimately decide what justice looked like in this situation. The baby who died in this case never had a chance to experience life. The child's entire existence was marked by pain and trauma inflicted by the very person who should have provided love and protection. This is the reality of child abuse at its most severe, lives cut short before they truly begin, potential snuffed out by violence and neglect. The legal outcome in Savawna Bowen's case would be determined by the courts, but no verdict could restore what was lost. No prison sentence could bring the baby back. The justice system could only attempt to hold accountable those responsible and perhaps provide some measure of closure for others who mourned the child. This case underscores the critical importance of early intervention in suspected child abuse cases. The baby had been brought to medical attention with injuries, but the intervention came too late to save the child's life. It raises questions about what more could have been done, whether there were earlier warning signs, whether the system responded quickly enough. For medical professionals, teachers, daycare workers, and others who interact with children regularly, this case is a reminder to trust your instincts. If something seems wrong, report it. The consequences of staying silent can be fatal. You might be the only person who notices that a child is in danger. For parents and caregivers watching this, please understand that abuse is never acceptable. If you feel overwhelmed, if you're struggling with anger or frustration toward your child, reach out for help. Call a parenting hotline. Talk to your doctor. Contact a mental health professional. There are resources available. No situation justifies harming a child. And for anyone who suspects a child is being abused, please make a report. Call your local child protective services or law enforcement. You don't need to be certain. If you have reasonable suspicion, that's enough. Let the professionals investigate. Your call could save a life. The baby in this case deserved so much more than the brief, pain-filled life that was given. That child deserved love, safety, and the opportunity to grow and thrive. Instead, that baby became another tragic statistic, another preventable death, another reminder of how vulnerable children are to those who should protect them. If this case moved you to action, whether that's learning about child abuse warning signs, supporting child advocacy organizations, or simply being more aware of the children in your community, please share this video. Like it, comment on it, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Awareness is the first step toward prevention, and your engagement helps spread these important messages. Case 8. Theresa Hernandez. March 2022. Oklahoma County. Pregnancy is supposed to be a time of anticipation and preparation. Parents dream about their child's future, pick out names, set up nurseries, and count down the days until they can finally meet their baby. But not every pregnancy is wanted, and not every mother feels joy at the prospect of a child. When a pregnancy is unwanted, there are legal options available. Adoption agencies stand ready to place children with families eager to love them. Safe haven laws allow parents to leave newborns at designated locations without facing criminal charges. These options exist specifically to prevent tragedy, to ensure that babies who are unwanted by their birth parents can still have a chance at life. But Theresa Hernandez, facing an unwanted pregnancy in Oklahoma County, did not choose any of these legal alternatives. Instead, in March of 2022, She made a choice that would result in the death of her unborn child and criminal charges against herself. The details of what happened are disturbing. Hernandez was pregnant and apparently desperate not to have the baby. Rather than seeking medical care, counseling, or one of the legal options available to her, she took matters into her own hands in a way that ended with the death of her full-term or near-term baby. When medical professionals eventually became involved, what they discovered was a stillborn infant, a baby who should have been born alive and healthy, but who had died as a result of Hernandez's actions. The medical examination revealed that this was not a natural miscarriage or an unavoidable tragedy. This was a death that resulted from intentional acts. Law enforcement investigated the circumstances surrounding the stillbirth. They interviewed Hernandez, examined medical evidence, consulted with experts, and built a case. The evidence pointed to second-degree murder. Hernandez had caused the death of her viable unborn child through her deliberate actions. She was arrested and charged accordingly. The case raised complex legal questions about when an unborn child's death constitutes murder, about fetal rights versus maternal rights, and about how the law should respond to women who harm their pregnancies. These are contentious issues in American law and society. Different states have different laws regarding fetal homicide. Different people have different moral and ethical views on when life begins and what legal protections should exist. But in Oklahoma, under the specific circumstances of this case, prosecutors determined that criminal charges were appropriate. Theresa Hernandez faced the reality of a murder charge. She could claim that she was desperate, that she didn't know what else to do, that she was in crisis. But the law does not excuse killing as a response to an unwanted pregnancy, not when legal alternatives exist. Rather than face trial, Hernandez made a decision. She accepted a plea agreement with prosecutors. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a negotiated sentence. This meant she admitted criminal responsibility for the death of her baby. The plea hearing would have been a somber affair. Hernandez would have had to allocate, to state in her own words what she had done and acknowledge her guilt. The judge would have questioned her to ensure she understood the charges and the consequences of her plea. Victim impact statements might have been read, though in this case the victim was the deceased infant who had no voice. The judge accepted the plea and imposed a prison sentence. Theresa Hernandez would spend years behind bars for what she had done. The sentence reflected the seriousness of taking a viable baby's life, while the plea agreement meant she avoided the possibility of an even longer sentence that might have resulted from a trial and conviction. For the community, the case was a reminder that unwanted pregnancy remains a crisis point for some women, and that crisis can lead to desperate and criminal acts. It highlighted the need for better access to pregnancy counseling, mental health services, and education about legal options. Organizations that work with pregnant women in crisis used cases like this to emphasize their services. They wanted women to know that if they were pregnant and scared, there were people who could help, options that didn't involve harming the baby or facing criminal charges. The case also reignited debates about fetal personhood and women's reproductive rights. Some saw Hernandez's prosecution as appropriate accountability for killing a baby who could have survived birth. Others worried about the implications of criminalizing women for pregnancy outcomes. These debates continue, with no easy answers. But setting aside the broader legal and ethical debates, this case at its core was about a baby who never got to take a first breath, never got to be held or loved, never got a chance at life. Whether you view that baby as a person from conception or from viability or from birth, the fact remains that a potential human life was extinguished. Theresa Hernandez made a choice when faced with an unwanted pregnancy, and that choice was to end her baby's life rather than give the child up for adoption or utilize safe haven options. She now lives with the consequences of that choice, both the legal consequences of her prison sentence and the moral weight of what she did. For anyone watching who finds themselves pregnant and unsure what to do, please know that there are resources available. You can call a pregnancy helpline, contact an adoption agency, or reach out to social services. If you're in crisis, there are people who want to help you and your baby. Please don't make a choice you can't undo. If this story resonated with you, please engage with this video by liking it, leaving your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. We cover these difficult cases because they matter, because the victims deserve to be remembered, and because awareness can lead to prevention. Case 9, Cherie Walker. July 2022. Tulsa County. Child abuse takes many forms. There's physical abuse, hitting, burning, shaking. There's emotional abuse, constant criticism, terrorizing, ignoring. There's neglect, failing to provide food, shelter, medical care, or supervision. And then there's sexual abuse, the exploitation of children for sexual purposes. Of all forms of child abuse, sexual abuse is perhaps the most damaging psychologically. It robs children of their innocence, betrays their trust, and can cause trauma that lasts a lifetime. When that sexual abuse occurs within the home, perpetrated or enabled by a parent, the betrayal is even more profound. In July of 2022, an 11-year-old girl in Tulsa County went into labor and gave birth at home. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. An 11-year-old child, a girl who should have been playing with friends, going to school, and enjoying childhood, was pregnant and giving birth. An 11-year-old cannot legally consent to sexual activity. Any sexual contact with a child that young is rape, full stop. And a pregnancy in a child that young represents not just one instance of abuse, but ongoing sexual assault. When authorities learned of the situation, they immediately began investigating. How had this happened? Who was responsible for impregnating an 11-year-old? And critically, where were the adults who should have been protecting this child? The girl's mother was identified as Cherie Walker. As investigators dug into the case, they discovered that Walker had been aware of the situation. She knew her 11-year-old daughter was pregnant. She knew her daughter was being sexually abused, and she did nothing to stop it. In fact, the evidence suggested that Walker had not only failed to protect her daughter, but had actively enabled the abuse to continue. When the child went into labor, Walker did not take her to a hospital where medical professionals would have reported the situation. Instead, the birth occurred at home, hidden from authorities who could have intervened. The identity of the person who impregnated the 11-year-old was also uncovered during the investigation. While the focus here is on Walker's role as the mother who failed to protect her child, it's important to note that the perpetrator of the sexual abuse also faced serious criminal charges. But Cherie Walker's culpability was significant. As a mother, she had a legal and moral duty to protect her child from harm. When she became aware that her 11-year-old daughter was being sexually abused, she should have immediately contacted law enforcement. She should have gotten her daughter medical care. She should have removed her from the situation and ensured the abuse stopped. Instead, Walker allowed the abuse to continue. She concealed the pregnancy. She facilitated a home birth to avoid detection. She enabled the ongoing sexual assault of her own child. Walker was charged with felony child neglect and enabling child abuse. The charges reflected her role in allowing this horrific situation to continue. While she may not have been the one perpetrating the sexual abuse, her failure to protect her daughter made her criminally responsible. The 11-year-old victim in this case suffered trauma on multiple levels. She was sexually abused, likely over a period of time. She experienced pregnancy at an age when her body was barely beginning puberty. She went through labor and childbirth as a child herself. And she was betrayed by her mother, the person who should have been her fiercest protector. The case shocked the community. How does an 11-year-old's pregnancy go unnoticed by teachers, doctors, or other adults in the child's life? The answer, in this case, was that Walker had apparently kept her daughter isolated and away from mandatory reporters who would have recognized the situation and intervened. This type of concealment is common in child sexual abuse cases. Abusers and enablers often isolate their victims, keeping them away from school, medical care, and other adults who might notice warning signs. The isolation makes the abuse easier to continue and harder for the victim to escape. The legal proceedings against Cherie Walker moved forward. The evidence of her knowledge and inaction was clear. She had enabled terrible harm to come to her child, and then concealed it from authorities. The prosecution sought to hold her fully accountable for her role in this tragedy. For the 11-year-old victim, the road to recovery would be long and difficult. She would need extensive therapy to process the sexual abuse, the pregnancy, and her mother's betrayal. She would need a safe placement where she could begin to heal. And she would need support from adults who would finally put her well-being first. The baby born to this 11-year-old child also needed consideration. A baby born from such circumstances would require careful placement and care. The situation was complex and heartbreaking all around. Cases like this highlight the critical importance of mandatory reporting laws. Teachers, doctors, counselors, and other professionals who work with children are required by law to report suspected abuse. These laws exist because children often cannot advocate for themselves or escape abusive situations without adult intervention. It also underscores the need for education about the warning signs of child sexual abuse. Children who are being abused may show changes in behavior, may become withdrawn or suddenly sexualized in their speech or actions, may have unexplained injuries, or may try to avoid certain people or situations. Adults need to be alert to these signs and willing to ask difficult questions. Cherie Walker's failure to protect her daughter resulted in immeasurable harm. An 11-year-old was sexually assaulted and forced to carry a pregnancy to term. The physical and psychological damage may never fully heal. And the person who should have been that child's safe harbor, her mother, was instead complicit in her abuse. The case serves as a stark reminder that we all have a responsibility to protect children. If you suspect a child is being abused, you must report it. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't worry about being wrong or creating trouble. The stakes are simply too high. If this case disturbed you, that's the appropriate response. These are disturbing realities that we must confront if we're going to protect vulnerable children. Please show your support for this important coverage by liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. Together, we can raise awareness and hopefully prevent future tragedies. Case 10, Desiree Castaneda. Case number 10, Desiree Castaneda. March 2023, Tulsa County. Our final case today shares disturbing similarities with the previous one, involving another mother in Oklahoma who catastrophically failed to protect her child from sexual abuse. The case of Desiree Castaneda demonstrates that these horrors are not isolated incidents, but reflect a pattern of parental betrayal that occurs far too often. In March of 2023, authorities in Tulsa learned of a situation that was almost incomprehensible. A 12-year-old girl had given birth to a baby. Like the previous case, this pregnancy in a child barely into adolescence could only be the result of rape. A 12-year-old cannot consent to sexual activity under any circumstances. The investigation quickly identified the father of the baby as a 24-year-old man. He was an adult who had sexually assaulted a child over a period of time, resulting in her pregnancy. The age gap alone, a grown man and a girl who should have been in middle school, made the predatory nature of the relationship clear. But this case, like the previous one, was not just about the rapist. It was also about the failure of a mother to protect her child. The 12-year-old victim was the daughter of Desiree Castaneda, and the evidence showed that Castaneda had not only been aware of the sexual relationship between her 12-year-old daughter and a 24-year-old man, but had allowed it to continue. In fact, the situation suggested that Castaneda had facilitated the relationship. Rather than recognizing this for what it was, the sexual abuse of a child, she had apparently treated it as though it were some kind of consensual relationship. She had enabled the 24-year-old to have access to her daughter. She had allowed the abuse to continue until her child became pregnant and gave birth. The failure is staggering. A mother's primary job is to protect her children from harm, especially from sexual predators. When Castaneda became aware that a grown man was interested in her 12-year-old daughter, her response should have been immediate and decisive. Cut off all contact, report him to police, protect her child at all costs. Instead, Castaneda enabled the relationship to continue. She allowed a predator ongoing access to her vulnerable child. And she did nothing to stop the abuse even when her daughter became pregnant. A pregnancy that should have been impossible to miss in a 12-year-old child. When the situation finally came to light, Castaneda was arrested and charged with child neglect and enabling child abuse. The charges reflected her role in allowing this terrible situation to occur and continue. While the 24-year-old man who raped a child faced his own serious criminal charges, Castaneda was held accountable for her failure to protect her daughter. The case raised troubling questions. How does a mother allow this to happen? What possible explanation could there be for permitting a grown man to have sexual contact with a 12-year-old girl? The answers, when they emerged, suggested a profound failure of judgment, morality, and maternal instinct. Some cases of parental failure to protect stem from the parent being afraid of an abusive partner, being manipulated or controlled, or genuinely not knowing about the abuse. But in Castaneda's case, The evidence indicated knowledge and permission. She had allowed this to happen. For the 12-year-old victim, the trauma was multi-layered and severe. She had been sexually abused over time. She had experienced pregnancy and childbirth at an age when most girls are just beginning to understand their changing bodies. She had been betrayed by her mother, who should have been her protector. And she now had to cope with being a child who had given birth to a child. The baby born from this abuse also faced an uncertain future. Born to a 12-year-old mother and a father who was a convicted rapist, the infant would need careful placement and support. The situation was tragic for both children, the 12-year-old victim and her newborn baby. The community of Tulsa responded with outrage and grief. How had this happened again? How had another child been so completely failed by the adults responsible for her safety? The case prompted calls for better oversight, better education, and better intervention when warning signs appear. Child advocacy organizations emphasize that these cases, while shocking, are not as rare as we'd like to believe. Child sexual abuse is disturbingly common, and parental failure to protect occurs more often than many people realize. The keys to prevention are awareness, education, and a willingness to report suspicions. Desiree Castaneda pleaded guilty to the charges against her. She admitted her role in enabling the abuse of her daughter. The plea spared the 12-year-old from having to testify at trial about the terrible things that had been done to her. But it also meant Castaneda acknowledged her guilt and accepted criminal consequences. The sentencing reflected the seriousness of her failure. A mother who enables the rape of her own child has violated one of society's most fundamental taboos. The judge imposed a sentence that would punish Castaneda for what she had done and send a message that such failures would not be tolerated. But no sentence could undo the harm. The 12-year-old girl would carry the psychological and physical scars of this abuse for the rest of her life. Her childhood had been stolen. Her innocence had been violated. And her own mother had allowed it to happen. This case, like all the others we've covered today, forces us to confront the reality that not all mothers are nurturing and protective. Some mothers fail their children in the most catastrophic ways possible. Some mothers enable abuse, neglect their responsibilities, or even actively harm their own offspring. These stories are difficult to hear. They challenge our assumptions about maternal instinct and parental love. They make us uncomfortable and angry and sad. But they must be told because only by acknowledging these realities can we work to prevent them. If you are a parent watching this, please understand the awesome responsibility you have. Your children depend on you for everything: food, shelter, safety, love. They cannot protect themselves from predators. They cannot advocate for themselves when adults harm them. You are their voice and their shield. Please take that role seriously. If you are a teacher, counselor, coach, or other adult who works with children, please be vigilant. Look for warning signs of abuse. Create an environment where children feel safe telling you if something is wrong. And report suspicions promptly. Better to be wrong than to fail to act when a child is in danger. And if you are someone who has experienced this kind of betrayal and abuse, please know that it was not your fault. Children are never responsible for adults harming them or failing to protect them. You deserve better. You deserved a mother who would have moved heaven and earth to keep you safe. And there are resources available now to help you heal. The 12-year-old victim in Desiree Castaneda's case is on a long road to recovery. She will need therapy, support, and adults in her life who will finally put her needs first. She will need help processing what happened to her and building a future despite the trauma of her past. It won't be easy, but with the right support, survivors can heal and build meaningful lives. Conclusion. We've covered 10 cases today, and each one represents a profound betrayal of the parent-child bond. From Meaonia Michelle Allen, who hid her newborn son's murder for 27 years, to Desiree Castaneda, who enabled the rape and pregnancy of her 12-year-old daughter. These cases span decades and different circumstances, but they share common threads: mothers who failed their most basic duty to protect their children. These stories are not easy to hear, and they weren't easy to research and present. But this is the reality of child abuse in America, in Oklahoma, in communities just like yours. These crimes don't happen in distant places or only to other people's children. They happen in small towns and big cities, in wealthy families and poor ones, across all demographics and backgrounds. The victims in these cases, Kelsey Smith Briggs, Logan Tucker, the unnamed children of Amy Leann Hall, and all the others, deserved so much more than they received. They deserved love, safety, and the chance to grow up and build their own lives. Instead, they became statistics, case numbers, cautionary tales. But we can honor their memory by learning from these tragedies. We can be more vigilant about the children in our communities. We can support organizations that work to prevent child abuse and support survivors. We can advocate for better resources for parents in crisis, better training for professionals who work with children, and better accountability for those who harm children. If you found this video informative and important, please show your support by clicking the like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on these cases or suggestions for future episodes. And most importantly, subscribe to Cold Case Hour and hit the notification bell so you never miss our in-depth coverage of cases that matter. Remember, awareness is the first step toward prevention. By watching, sharing, and discussing these cases, you're helping to shine a light on the darkest corners of human behavior. You're helping to keep victims' stories alive. And you're joining a community committed to justice and protection for the most vulnerable among us. Thank you for watching this difficult episode. Take care of yourselves, hug your loved ones, and remember that most parents love their children fiercely and would never harm them. These cases represent the exceptions, not the rule. But those exceptions must be confronted, prosecuted, and prevented. This has been Cold Case Hour. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves.